Welcome to Pier-Glass Poetry Spotlight number 10, where we will visit one poem and its author, but with a little twist this time. I'm Stan Galloway, your host, and today we'll be looking at Bilbea's Response by Jessica Traynor. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Stan. It's lovely to be here.
Jessica is coming to us today from Dublin, Ireland. She is the author of 3 poetry collections, including Pit Lullabies, out this year from Blood Axe Books. Bilbea's Response comes from that collection. While this poem can stand alone, it was written, as the title suggests, in response to another poem, specifically Carl Sandburg's Bilbea, published in Poetry Magazine, October 1918. In a departure from our usual format, I'd like to begin with us listening to Sandburg read his poem, courtesy of poetryfoundation.org.
A very short piece titled Bilbea, read from tablet writing of Babylonian excavations of the 4th millennium BC. Bilbea, I was in Babylon on Saturday night. I saw nothing of you anywhere. I was at the old place and the other girls were there, but no Bilbea. Have you gone to another house or city? Why don't you write? I was sorry. I walked home half sick. Tell me how it goes. Send me some kind of a letter. And take care of yourself.
Jessica, would you follow that by reading your poem for us?
I would indeed. Bilbea's Response. You ask why I don't write. The tower's all on fire and the plague fleas dancing on the rats, and you ask why I don't think of you. Maybe I wrote your name with menstrual blood on the Ishtar gate. Maybe a half-starved bastard in an alley bears your name. Maybe, though, I simply forgot one cock among many, and even a kind word or two wasn't enough to allow you entry to the small store of memories I keep.
Thank you, Jessica. There's a tradition in poetry of responding to poems by other authors. For example, Sir Walter Raleigh's Nymph's Reply to the Shepherd in answer to Christopher Marlowe's The Passionate Shepherd to His Love, both from the end of the 16th century. Tell us a little about how you see the reply poem as a genre and what attracts you to that tradition.
You know, I think the reply poem is just a fantastic way to kind of codify a kind of discourse that you might not get away with in the everyday. And I think you see that tension between the Marlowe poem and the Raleigh poem. And I mean, the Raleigh poem is just one of my favorites. I mean, the lines are so beautiful, but there's such a kind of there's a little jibe going on in it. You know, there's a little, in the response, there is a sense of actually we're changing up the discourse a little, we're changing what we're talking about. And there's an irreverence there, which I just really enjoy. I think the idea of two poets in dialogue like that, hiding all of their little agendas behind these beautiful words, is just really exciting. And it reminds me again that poetry is a dialogue. It's a communicative art form. Often we become so mired in the sense of ourselves as individuals working within our own frameworks and milieu that the reader can become a very distant idea, you know, a kind of an idea that lives elsewhere. And I think in the notion of creating a conversation between two poems like that, it's revivifying. You know, I feel like anyway, I'm enlivening something, or taking on a baton, in this case from 1918. You know, and it's so wonderful to hear Sandburg read that work, to hear his voice and to hear that casualness of language and that freedom of language from that era. And just the kind of privilege of being able to respond to that. It's another reminder of the way that literature collapses time barriers and just creates a conversation that can, hopefully, if done right, transcend and bring together and connect different ideas from different eras.
I agree that hearing Sandburg conveys an irreverence that maybe you don't hear in your own head if you read the poem on the page. And it's that casual diction, which both of these poems use, both the complaint by Sandberg's speaker and in Bilbea's reply in your poem. How much of that voice is the speaker's voice, a conscious choice on your part to create a character, a persona, Bilbea, and how much is this a natural voice to the way you present other poems? Or let me put it another way. How much of this poem is Bilbea speaking, and how much of this is simply your own voice using Bilbea?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. And I want to tell you a little bit about how this particular poem came about, actually, because it came about through a dialogue that I was having with another Irish poet. And we were emailing back and forth, and he sent me this particular poem because I had been interested in the idea of the world's oldest love poem and various iterations of that. And the really interesting thing is that the oldest love poem in the world is called the Love Song for Shu Shin. And I've actually seen the little cuneiform clay tablet that it's inscribed on, which is in the museum in Istanbul. But it's written in the voice of a woman. And it's a woman preparing for this marriage between, she is the figure of the goddess, and she is preparing to marry the king in this kind of ritualistic marriage that kind of allows for the fertility ritual. It's all sorts of things like that. But it's written in the voice of a woman, and it's full of desire, which is something that I think has been kind of scrubbed from the records for millennia, the idea of women's desire. And when my friend sent me this particular poem, I got it. It arrived in my inbox on a particularly cranky Tuesday afternoon when I was feeling a bit annoyed with the world in general. And I thought, okay, this isn't the world's oldest love poem, but it's incredibly old. It's taken from these clay tablets, and it's this very wistful poem written from the point of view of a man towards a woman. And I kind of got thinking about, my goodness, what was the reality of this woman's life like? And it's really sweet that he thought of her while he was out in the town on a Saturday night, but what was he thinking about on a Tuesday afternoon? Was he worrying about her then?
Right.
So I wrote the poem incredibly spontaneously, and I read Sandberg's poem and I immediately wrote this response. So yes, absolutely, a lot of it is my own voice and attitude, and kind of unashamedly so, because I feel that Sandberg already introduces a contemporaneity to the whole experiment, which kind of calls for that response. But I think as well, one of the things I always think about is that we have to be so careful with persona poems, because it is really seductive to inhabit another person's experience, but obviously not always appropriate. But I think there are enough layers of artifice and interpretation and history here that I can just about get away with it. With huge respect for Sandberg and huge fondness, I think I probably couldn't have written the poem if I didn't find the original quite charming in a certain way, in a way that I wanted to challenge, though, as well.
Yeah, I agree with that charm that that is in the original, and yet it's more than just a little charming vignette. Martina Evans in the Irish Times says that your work contains a fine, delicate lyricism that belies a social consciousness. And so we've looked at that lyricism, and the playfulness of these two poems, but that social consciousness, I think, is also there. And I see a kind of innate feminism in the Bilbea that you've created here, as well as an exposure of the egotism of Sandberg's speaker. And so I wonder, in what ways do you see the poem speaking specifically to readers, women, in our own day?
I mean, I think it goes back to that notion of female agency and also ideas of sexuality and desire, where I think, often we reassure ourselves that we've moved forwards a certain amount, and then we realize that actually ideas and people's approaches and society's approaches as a whole to issues of female desire and sexuality and things like childbirth and menopause and death all of these things often throw up quite bizarre responses that do need to be challenged. And there is still a kind of a sense of a romanticization of the kind of the pursuit of the woman that I kind of rail against. And I suppose Pit Lullabies, the collection that I've read from today, is a collection which is all about, it's all about parenthood, but it's also about the experience of carrying a child, of birthing a child, the uncanniness of giving your body and yourself and your entire being over to another being in this way, and the repercussions of that. And I find, still, while there are notable exceptions to the rule, that there isn't a huge amount of writing that focuses on those kinds of things. And female desire is a part of it. And to go back to what I was saying a few minutes ago about the notion of the oldest love poem in the world being written from the point of view of a woman, there's a long, wonderful tradition of poems about female desire written by women, which have been, as I said, kind of scrubbed from the records and occasionally come back to light. There's a wonderful 8th century Irish poem called Donal Óg, which just means young Donal. And it's a wonderful complaint written from the point of view of a woman about this guy abandoning her. And it's full of vitriol and kind of vigor and this cursing, hexing energy, which I just find tremendously exciting and honest. And it's a poem that was kind of known in Irish circles, but was brought back into more common readership in the 19th century when Lady Augusta Gregory, co-founder of the Abbey Theatre with W.B. Yeats, did a translation of it. And she's another woman whose work is often overlooked and seen in the shadow of this great man, this great saviour of Irish literature and culture, this great champion of Irish literature and culture. But the work that she was doing was kind of quite subversive in its own way. So I'm interested still in all of those little opportunities to subvert, to poke, to challenge. And I kind of hope that that's what this poem does in a way.
Yes, and I think it does. And so you mentioned the context of Pit Lullabies, and I just want to veer that direction just for a moment. This is a poem that stood out to me from that collection, partly because it was different, from the mundanity of child rearing, childbearing, household concerns. And I just wonder if you could talk about, you've suggested that this is in the collection as a way to remind us of the existence of female desire in the midst of everything else that a woman has to deal with. And so maybe I'm asking you to defend or justify including this poem in Pit Lullabies.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting question, actually. And I was so glad that you chose this poem because I was very fond of it. And it was one that I wondered about its place in the collection. But I have placed it quite close to the end of the collection, where there's a kind of an emergence from the metaphorical pit, which really represents, experiences of postpartum depression and all of the difficulties, kind of mental and physical and otherwise, that we can find ourselves mired in at various transitional times in our lives. And for me, it was childbirth, but we can find ourselves in these places at a number of different times. And in the book, I have this fractured sequence of Pit Lullabies, which are poems that are written kind of from a place of darkness. And sometimes when we find ourselves in those dark and difficult places, we realize that we need to kind of rearrange the furniture and make ourselves comfortable for a while because we're not getting out of there anytime soon, that this is a process that needs to be worked through. And so there are 10 Pit Lullabies that run throughout the book. And each of them is an attempt to speak from a sense of darkness and distance to my own child. But as the collection progresses, there is a sense of maybe not a moving completely out of the darkness, because the final poem in the book is called Lullaby. It's not a pit lullaby, but it's still something. It's still a night song to a child. And so the dawn hasn't quite appeared yet. But as the collection progresses, there's a sense, I felt in my ordering of it, of a slight reclamation of the self, and a creeping in of concerns, preoccupations, excitements that are not necessarily so closely stitched to that mother-child bond. Perhaps some kind of reclamation of the self, I think, that takes place. I think it's subtle, so I'm glad you picked it out, because it's not something I would necessarily, I think, have had the opportunity to talk about otherwise.
Yeah, and thank you, because I that resonates exactly with what I assumed about it being in the collection, and I'm so glad that you were able to articulate it for us. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap this up?
Not at all. Just thank you so much for having me as part of this series. I've become addicted over the past couple of episodes, so I'm really looking forward to experiencing the other poets you bring our way too.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Jessica has been poet in residence at the Yates Society Sligo and is currently DLR Lexicon Poet in Residence. Her previous books, Liffey Swim and The Quick, are available from Daedalus Press. You can learn more at her website, jessicatraynor.com. For Pier-Glass Poetry, I'm Stan Galloway, wishing you a poetic day.